Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Multi-State ISAC National Webcast, which focuses on the topic of cybersecurity while traveling. We have a great turnout today with over 760 registrants for today's event, so thank you so much to everyone for joining today's call. Recommendations for cybersecurity while traveling often sound like they were taken directly from the plot of a spy movie. Use clean, throwaway devices, accounts, and passwords. Assume your devices and information will be compromised. Pull the batteries out of your devices before discussing sensitive information. Similar, although slightly less scary, recommendations abound for travelers going on vacation. Don't post your location online. Don't use the public Wi-Fi. In this presentation, our presenter will provide insight into the targeting, theft, scams, and espionage that has driven the creation of these often touted recommendations so that you can intelligently choose which recommendations are appropriate for your next trip. We are delighted and honored to welcome our presenter today, Stacey Wright. Stacey is the Intel Program Manager at the Center for Internet Security, where she runs the Intel team for the multi-state ISAC. The Intel team focuses on providing strategic, operational, and tactical cyber threat intelligence on state, local, tribal, and territorial government cyber issues, and is dedicated to providing comprehensive, actionable intelligence analysis. Prior to her employment at CIS, Stacey was the Cyber Intelligence Analyst for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Albany Division, where she was the FBI's liaison to the MSISAC. Stacey, thank you so much for participating on today's national webcast, and I'll turn things over to you now.
Thank you very much. So that's a quick intro as to who I am. I think what matters a little bit more is why I'm talking about this and why I track this. I got started looking at this topic well over a decade ago because I personally just found it very interesting. I always heard these recommendations, and I started my career as an information systems specialist and never really understood them, so I started digging into it. What I'm going to talk about today is a lot of the information I've picked up over the years and how I look at this information, how I put it together in a way that makes sense to me. It's really important because here at the MSISAC, we end up answering this question a lot. We have different people reaching out to us saying that they're traveling to a different country, or their mayors or governors or someone they know is traveling, and can we help them? And that's why we've put this presentation together in a way that will hopefully help you make some of these decisions. So I started out, as I often do, trying to look at this from a couple of different perspectives. And classic information technology, I looked at it from the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And that didn't really work. I also tried to look at it from the focus of the tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTPs, and the vulnerabilities. That also just didn't work. It got confusing. There were too many players, too many groups to try and track. So I tried motivations and actors. And again, it didn't work because a lot of times I had to go back to the vulnerabilities or TTPs, or I was dealing with something that was unusual or different that didn't fit into these classic definitions. What I found did work is the age-old risk equation: threat equals vulnerability times impact. Threats are obvious. It's when you're traveling, there are threats. You know there are threats. They're just a little bit different than the 5 actor groups we frequently look at, or than man-made versus natural threats we look at. And the vulnerabilities, again, these are obvious vulnerabilities. They're just slightly different. They're not always device-based or equipment-based. Plus, I happen to like Finding Nemo, so I threw Finding Nemo in there, and I find it's a traveling movie. It actually goes over really well when I'm talking with people because almost everybody's seen it, so they can understand the references that I make to Finding Nemo. Plus, cartoons are never a bad thing. So the threats I've put together, and this is how when I look at cybersecurity while traveling, these are the threats that I study. The first one is oops. It's the accidents, the things that are unintentional that you don't plan for. The second one is financial. A lot of times this is cyber crime or fraud related, but it's not always. Sometimes it has nothing to do with cyber. It's as simple as the theft of a laptop because the laptop is worth money. Then next up is espionage. And I'm not talking just espionage at the advanced persistent threat, APT, or nation-state level. I'm also talking about corporate espionage, the commercial-based type. And then finally, legal. There are a lot of different laws out there, depending on what country you're in and what country you're going to. So looking at the threats from the perspective of what's legal, where you are, and where you're going makes a huge difference. So I think OOPS is probably the easiest one to look at. The accidental stuff. We all make mistakes. It's classic. We leave the briefcase on the floor at our feet. We leave our purse on the back of their chair. And our devices are in there. These often do not mean that we're being targeted because of who we are or what we're carrying. It's simply those devices are worth money in the local pawn shop or the local back alley store. So that's a classic way that devices get stolen by pickpockets. There are also scams you have to watch out for. One of the very common ones outside of the United States is a scam where you leave your device on the table. You've got your phone, your tablet, because you're eating in a restaurant. People come up to you with a map or a newspaper. They put it down on the table over your device. They want you to help them figure out where they're going. So they'll have a map and ask for directions. The scam isn't that they're asking for directions. It's actually because they've got something covering your device and they're distracting you while they lift your device off the table. So pretty basic scam that happens outside the United States on a fairly routine basis. But the other thing is sometimes we make those mistakes because we're just not quite thinking about it. The picture on the left is one I took in an airport while traveling, and you'll notice there's an unattended computer. So when I first took this picture, that computer did not have a black screen. It actually had negotiation and contract details up there for a particular company, and I was just sitting in the airport waiting for a flight. I watched this guy who was sitting there with his laptop doing some work get up and walk away. Walked away from his laptop. I'm like, ooh, perfect picture opportunity. So I took a picture. And then I realized it was probably not a good thing because that picture showed the details of his work. So I waited. And if you know laptops, I have a feeling a lot of people on the call right now are IT related, and they're probably cringing at this. You know there's on average about a 10-minute lockout for your screen to go blank or put up a screensaver. So yes, I waited 10 minutes to take the second picture. He never came back. In fact, it took him another 10 minutes to come back because he had gone to get something to eat. And no, he didn't know anybody on either side of him. I was there long enough that I watched him get up, pack up, and leave without any of the other people around him realizing or engaging in him in any way. So he had truly walked away from an unlocked laptop with sensitive data on his screen. And sometimes mistakes are just that obvious because we're focused on something else. Unfortunately, they're not always that simple. It turns out that there's a thing called the Corruption Perceptions Index, CPI. And there are some places when you're traveling where they will give you quote-unquote taxes for bringing your laptops in and out of the country or other devices. Now, I don't know about you, but when I travel, I don't really think about how I prove that I brought my laptop into the country. So if I was to get stopped by somebody as I'm trying to catch a flight, I would have a lot of trouble trying to prove that this was my laptop. I'd probably just pay the tax. And that's what they're counting on. So it's really a simple thing by some of these countries. Now, I put up some samples, one from Armenia, which according to the Corruption Perception Index is rated 113 out of 180 countries. So it's not even at the bottom of the list. The other one, Russia, is 131. So you're going to run into this in a lot of places. But up here, I also have an example for something called the Business Email Compromise, BEC Compromise. You might have heard about this. The BEC Compromise is a series of scams that target users. Frequently, they're emails like the one on the screen, where it is sent from the CEO's name to the Finance Department or Human Resources Department, asking for either a wire transfer or the W-2 information for all employees. Now, you would think most times you wouldn't fall for something that obvious. But what we're seeing happen is they actually compromise the email accounts of CEOs to do this. Or if they can't get into the CEO's account or other senior executives' email accounts, they fake them, they spoof them. They will create John Smith, CEO at yahoo.com and send the email from that account because they're counting on nobody recognizing that it's from Yahoo instead of your internal domain. Now, this matters from a travel perspective because they're smart enough. They're doing the research to figure out that CEOs of particular companies, who you are. They're also looking to see when they're traveling. And that's where we see the travel component come in, is they wait for the CEO to be out of the office. So an email like this, sent from an iPhone or an Android, whatever's appropriate for the company, makes a lot more sense to happen. The other thing on this slide is the reward point fraud. We are seeing reward point fraud. There have been quite a few incidents internationally where reward point accounts were either leaked openly or broken into. And we're seeing a variety of this fraud because those points are actually worth money. They can get you goods and services, they can get you free flights, free upgrades, and frequently we have credit cards linked to them so we can have our online profiles and buy tickets. All of that translates into financial theft. And that's something we're starting to see more of. But I'm going to point something out. If you can get into a reward point account, it also gives you a lot of inside access about the person doing the travel, where they like to sit on the plane, what hotels they prefer, how often they travel, their upcoming tickets. And that's where you can get into espionage. So espionage is where we go a little bit more devious, and I want to reference the National Counterintelligence and Security Center. This is one of the big U.S. agencies that publishes a lot of information about espionage targeting of U.S. companies and governments. They say very directly, assume your device has been compromised, which I think is pretty scary when you think about it. There's a lot of information you have on those devices. It's not just your business information. It's things like your auto logins. You have your passwords saved so you can get into your LinkedIn account, your Facebook account, text your family and friends, all of your contact information. Even if you aren't the target, you may be their way into a different target. And that's why they truly say, assume your devices have been compromised. Now, if you're in IT, you know there are different ways to compromise devices. And you're probably thinking about somebody just turning it on, guessing your password or a PIN number or whatever, and looking at it, which is why the next recommendation is there. The U.S. Cyber Consequences Unit is a 501c3 nonprofit that provides cybersecurity recommendations. They actually put forth the recommendation, put anti-tamper seals over your hard drive cover and case screws. I can't speak to exactly why they would make a recommendation like that, but I can reverse engineer it. And that's pretty scary because that means that if you reverse engineer it, they're saying people are actually pulling your hard drive from your laptop, from any other device, and cloning it or doing a bit-by-bit copy. That's a whole different level of threat to the data you're carrying. Not on the screen is a different recommendation that I picked up from a university. The university said never accept a patch or update while on travel outside the United States unless you are directly connected to the enterprise network. If you receive the message, network update received, you should consider your device compromised. That's, again, a really specific recommendation. And if you reverse engineer a recommendation like that, it suggests that that university had seen someone compromise a device by installing a fake patch or some type of other update. So it's a different way of thinking about it. Rather than reverse engineering the software or the device, reverse engineer the recommendations you're seeing. You can do that with the next one from the National Counterintelligence and Security Center. Remove the battery. If you reverse engineer that actual recommendation, it suggests that the compromise occurred even when the device was turned off. That means that the only way to protect your devices, as far as they are concerned, and they should be an expert in this, is to actually pull a battery from the device. If you look at other recommendations out there, you know people can turn on your devices remotely. You know you can turn on cameras and microphones and record things using malware. So my guess is that recommendation is driven from these types of malware. A China expert from the Brookings Institution once said that he copies and pastes his password from a USB thumb drive. He never actually types his password directly because, and I'm quoting now, the Chinese are very good at installing keylogger software on your laptop. There's a lot of recommendations out there about China in particular installing malware. So it all ties back to the espionage factor. But you still have to worry about the laws of the country you're in as well. The one example I have up there about Ryan Pate from the UAE, it happened a couple years ago where he made a comment on Facebook while in the United States. He then went back to the UAE and was arrested for that comment because they have laws restricting derogatory comments about the companies you work for. So even though he was protected by the freedom of speech in the U.S., that did not extend to his overseas travel. And that's a warning in and of itself. And unfortunately, UAE is not the only country where you have to worry about that activity. Some countries out there actually ban access to specific websites. Sometimes those bans are related to specific events. There is an event called Draw Muhammad Day. Draw Muhammad Day happens every year in the springtime, and it is a day where it started out of threats to some folks who, actually the artists from the cartoon South Park, who had the Islamic prophet Muhammad as one of their characters. In the Muslim religion, that can be offensive, drawing depictions of Muhammad. There were threats made to the artists who drew the South Park episode, and that spiraled into an event called Draw Muhammad Day, where people around the globe participate by drawing depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. This is a very specific event on a particular day, but we find that in some countries related to that event, they ban websites like YouTube and Facebook because they find it offensive. So when you're traveling, you have to take some of that into account. Sometimes, though, it's a lot more generic. It is a simple ban on the software itself. You may also find bans on things like encryption. China and Russia very specifically limit the importation and exportation of encrypted devices. They say that any attempt to conceal encrypted disk partitions or lying to a border official about their existence can actually be a criminal offense, which also means when you're doing things like browsing to an HTTP secure website, you're using encryption, and that may be against some of the laws of those countries. So you have to really be careful what you're looking at. In Russia, the Russians actually require tech companies doing business in the country to move Russian user data to domestic servers. During 2016, LinkedIn failed to comply with this requirement and had issues with the Russian government for that reason. Also in Russia, the U.S. consulate in Vladivostok actually states on their website that the importation and use of GPS systems and other radio electronic devices are subject to special rules and regulations. No user can import GPS equipment in any manner unless it is properly and fully documented by the traveler in accordance with official instructions. So while this isn't current, we do know that in December 1997, a U.S. citizen was imprisoned for 10 days on espionage charges for using a GPS device. I'm not so sure that would happen now, 20 years later, but it's certainly worth a consideration. I also have France up there because France has a state of emergency. The state of emergency started about 2 years ago, and it was recently extended until July 15th, 2017. It's the 5th extension. The state of emergency is important to know about because it provides for an extension of special security powers. While they haven't used it on American citizens yet, there is very broad language in here that the government can access and copy in whole or part any information accessed from an initial system discovered on a premise, which includes cloud data, and that the Ministry of Interior can take any measure to block websites and social networks that are inciting or glorifying terrorist attacks. That can be done immediately and without judicial control. So while this may not be a huge threat to most people who are traveling, it's an example of something to be aware of because you never know what's happening internally to the country where you're going. Which brings me to some different laws that exist out there. Pakistan has a very broad cyber law that allows for mass surveillance and criminalizing satire, back to that Draw Muhammad Day example. China authorizes security reviews and a cleanup of the Internet. The Ministry of Industry and Information Technology on January 22nd of this year issued the cleanup of the Internet, meaning that any VPN services in China need a government license to operate legally. Now, I'm not sure how that's going to apply if you're a traveler going to China, but you would certainly want to think about using VPN to get back to your company because it could have ramifications for anything you're doing. They also say that, and this is a law, that data allowed out of China has to pass a security evaluation. So it's something to keep in mind. You may have data on your laptop sensitive to negotiations, contracts, intellectual property, contacts you have, and they could theoretically use this law to look into all of that. Turkey and the UAE, though, blocked the use of VPN, virtual private networks. In the UAE, the use of a VPN fraudulently can result in imprisonment or fine of up to $500,000. In Turkey, they block it, but they also block Tor. Tor is the privacy network, originally known as the Onion Router. It's an anonymity network. And if you use it to circumvent Internet censorship in the country, it can get you into serious criminal trouble there. That restriction was confirmed in place on December 12, 2016. The UK actually has another law called the Investigatory Powers Act, nicknamed the Snoopers Charter. Parts of it took place and went live on December 30th, 2016. This is an update to Britain's surveillance legislation and includes new authorities such as the ability to collect the browsing records of everyone in the country. Now, the big deal about it that's generating a lot of online discussion right now is the authority to collect data. Not everything in the law has gone official yet. It hasn't been fully implemented. So there's a lot of people watching to see how this is going to roll out. These are just a couple examples of the different laws you can run into. A lot of other countries have different laws that will affect you in varying ways, and that includes just the online content production. So posting to a blog or something else may cause issues in certain countries. The whole point is that changes are happening fast. Which brings me to the U.S. I'm assuming a lot of people listening to this are located in the U.S., and these are 3 different U.S. laws and agreements that it's worth being aware of. The Wassenaar Arrangement on Export Controls for Conventional Arms and Dual-Use Goods and Technologies, really long name for an arrangement with 41 participating countries. It's a multilateral export control, and what it's doing is trying to prevent destabilizing accumulations of technology. Encryption in particular is looked at in this, but other things are as well. The Department of Commerce has the Commerce Control List and Export Administration Regulations, EAR 99. Now, anything you carry that's commercial is probably not going to be a major issue. Once it's gone commercial, you don't have to look at it too closely. But EAR 99 actually includes provisions for things like intrusion software, which might include pen testing software. It also includes encryption software and electronics and computers. So it's something that everybody in the IT industry in particular really needs to be aware of, because a lot of us either do this type of work or we do it on our own time. We may be traveling and have this set up on our equipment. So it's something to keep in mind. The Department of Treasury Office of Foreign Asset Control, OFAC regulations, are economic and trade sanctions based on U.S. foreign policy and national security goals. They affect certain countries in particular more than others, and look at countries like Cuba, Iran, and Syria. But they can also help you figure out some of the export control issues you may run into. For instance, the Center for the Study of Organized Crime, aka the Cybercrime Office, is actually an Iranian entity. So you can get requests from these entities to share technology and not realize that you are actually exporting it just by answering an email. All 3 of these laws or agreements, I am not a lawyer. I won't say that I can speak to them authoritatively. My best advice is know them and talk to your legal department so that you know whether anything you're carrying could be an issue or a problem. Which brings me to vulnerabilities. Those were the threats. Vulnerabilities, I can bring out 6 vulnerabilities from what I routinely see. First one is carrying too much information. Then we have insecure devices and data, oversharing, greater exposure, those left behind, and the lack of due diligence. So starting with the simple again, carrying too much information. It's something I've repeatedly mentioned throughout this webcast. Carrying extra information on your laptop, you may not even realize it's on your device. And I'm truly not necessarily talking about the files and documents. It could be your emails. Everything in your sent items and trash folder is fair game. Your contact list. Often that information is just as valid. It's also about keeping in mind that you have your recycling bin and you may not have deleted everything. I've got the picture of the CSI stick up there. This is a rather open source technology where you can buy a USB stick that plugs into any device and automatically downloads everything off of it. So back to that recommendation about traveling through border security. If your device leaves your hands, assume it's compromised, because even if they didn't put malware on it, 30 minutes with a CSI stick and everything off your device is on that USB drive. It's also fair to keep in mind that your devices contain a lot of information like automatic logins. You want to get into accessing different programs. Your VPN is set up so you can click on it and VPN in. All of that information is very sensitive and very carefully analyzed in some border crossings. While you're traveling through the country, you're focused on one set of laws. There's one set. When you cross the border, there's actually different laws that can apply just because you're at a border crossing. So when you cross those borders, you have to be very careful about what information you're carrying and bringing on your device. Which brings me back to insecure devices in general. The easiest way to access a room to get access to a device is actually dead presidents in the United States. It's pictures of presidents on green currency. Flip some of those to a hotel concierge, and chances are you can get into any room you want in a lot of hotels. There's also things like public postings. The information I have up there from China is from public postings of bids and contracts in China. So it's outright saying they're looking for ways to put malware or software on other people's phones. And $24,000 and $16,000 isn't a lot of money for that type of software. Software to monitor phone conversations and text messages in real time, that's pretty easy to do. The can I borrow your phone scam is another scam that you willingly give up your device and make it insecure for someone. This started in U.S. airports, or at least that's the first place I heard of it happening. And people would come up to you in U.S. airports and ask you if they could make a phone call off of your device or send an email. Now, if you're thinking about that, they could do a lot of things. They could send a text message to sign you up for a service, and it's financial fraud. They could access their email account and download malware onto your device. I won't say that I ever caught anybody at it, but every time I heard of this happening, it was in the airports around D.C., which I think was a little bit unusual. Since then, we've heard of this scam spread throughout the world. So it's truly simple. Can I borrow your device? You unlock it and hand it over because somebody needs to call their mom or something else. They have a sob story, and you're trying to be the nice person. And then the final warning is hotel safes aren't safe. If you ever stayed at a hotel with a safe, you know you can enter your own combination in it. But people forget to unlock those when they leave. So there is a master password that will get you into safes. Those master passwords are actually in the safe documentation, which you can buy online through places like eBay. So you could buy a safe instruction manual and get the master password to a hotel safe and open any hotel safe. It's truly that simple in some situations. Which brings me to the issue of oversharing. Now, I put the 2008 Mumbai terrorist attack up there because there is a well-documented, although little-known side effect or incident that occurred during this terrorist attack. As some of you probably remember, it went on for almost a day as terrorists were in Mumbai and going around and shooting people. They had used things like GPS to figure out where they're going, Street View. They used GPS to figure out where they were going to land because they came in over the water, and to figure out where foreign nationals were likely to be. One of the things we saw out of this, though, was people were tweeting where they were, where they had holed up. And the Mumbai terrorists actually used those tweets to find the locations of people they were looking to target. So it was something that was a little bit scary to think about from the sense of you had a control cell back in Pakistan giving directions to the terrorists based on our online tweets. There's another incident that occurred. One of the gentlemen who was murdered during that terrorist attack was staying in a hotel, and the terrorists went into the hotel and went to his suite. He was staying in one of the penthouse suites, and he told them he was a school teacher. They took his identification documents and sent that information back to the Pakistani cell. The Pakistani cell then did an internet search to find his name. That gave proof to the lie. He was not a school teacher. There's a reason he was in the penthouse suite, was because he was a very high-ranking business official. As I mentioned, he was murdered. It's because they used the internet to actually find out his real identity, even though he had told them something else. And that's a different thing that we're seeing. Terrorists are just as aware of our information. So being a public persona backfires upon occasion, as in this instance. In a slightly less deadly case, we also see academic solicitation, which happens just as frequently as any of the other types of scams and frauds I'm talking about. Academic solicitation is usually used by nation states, and it's where they contact you, not to buy equipment, not to try and trick you into giving away information, so much as they want you to come and give a presentation, or they want you to review a paper. This is why academics are frequently targeted. When you give a presentation, you're going over. They'll pay for your travel to that foreign conference in the hopes of targeting you for additional information while you're there. The other variant where they target you for papers and other things is the hopes that if they give you a paper that is wrong, you will use your knowledge to correct it and make it accurate. And then I have a picture up there of an obvious Facebook post. And this is somebody that posted they got a new car. This is great, right? Have you ever thought about the fact that a post like this gives away your bank security information? The color of your car is often a bank security question. Well, you just told everybody who sees your pictures on Facebook or LinkedIn or wherever else what color your car is, therefore the answer to that question. So it's a very simple method of oversharing, but something else to keep track of. One of the last techniques that I worry about, one of the last vulnerabilities, is the greater exposure. When you're traveling, it's easier to target you. Your defenses are in a different place. You're not quite as comfortable. So you have to be aware of other things. We see in a lot of foreign countries that they actually shut down internet access at protest sites. So you may not be involved in the protest in any way. You may just happen to be there and relying on internet access, like we all do, but internet access gets shut down because of the protest near where you are. Other things like the Olympics. We saw a lot of targeting over several of the last few Olympics. The different countries involved, targeting of the athletes, targeting of the visitors, simply because they were there and they were vulnerable. Targeting like that doesn't necessarily mean that they are targeting you by the country you're in. These are public events, so it's notorious. You go there from other countries, and it might be a case where a third party from a third country is targeting an American citizen or someone else who's at this second country, just because it's an easier way your defenses are down. And then, of course, I had to put up there the NASA scientist who recently made the news because he was detained at the U.S. border and forced to unlock his phone. It's just an awareness issue. Border crossings are one of the highest and most vulnerable points for legal issues or legal threats as you're traveling. But that greater exposure can also mean that you're exposed to threats and vulnerabilities that are beyond what you are normally exposed to. Things like FinFisher. FinFisher was spyware that was bought by 32 different governments, used mostly to target dissidents in those countries. But it became legal spyware in those countries. Hacking Team was the famous Italian breach in July 2015, and we know they sold similar software to other governments. In Russia, they have something called SWARM. It's the System for Operational and Investigative Surveillance and Activities. This is actually run by the Federal Security Service, FSB. FSB is the modern equivalent to the KGB, and they're responsible for counterintelligence, anti-terrorism, and surveillance of the for military purposes. SWARM allows the Russian government to lawfully monitor telephone, internet, fax, and email communications. And according to a released bid contract that was put out, SWARM 2 was supposed to be monitoring deep packet inspection, be able to do keyword searches. So the idea is every bit of internet traffic could be monitored for keywords. The other thing SWARM 2 is supposed to be able to do is social media monitoring. Other than that, there's also the issue that there's different cultures out there. It's not just about the laws and the exposure and everything else. Sometimes you're vulnerable because of the culture itself or who you are. In Mexico a couple years ago, this story broke where the Mexican cartels targeted radio engineers. They were kidnapping them and forcing them to build a radio network so the cartels could communicate offline. It was nicknamed Narcotel. As you can see, there were a bunch of arrests out of it, but those kidnapped engineers were murdered after they had done the work for the cartels. In Antwerp, Belgium, there was a story a couple years ago where 2 IT administrators were honey-trapped and tricked into participating in the compromise of the Antwerp, Belgian port. You can read about that one. There's some really great articles online about that. But they took these IT administrators and slowly brought them into doing illegal activities so they could compromise the Port Authority systems and move cargo goods out of the ports without it going on official record. In South Africa, there's a machine they nicknamed the Grabber, and it's only supposed to be used to law enforcement for monitoring purposes, so you could listen to or track cell phones and so on. It was a corrupt official, sold it to some criminals, and they used it to blackmail other people. We know Bluetooth sniffing happens by the press and by criminals around the world. So all of this comes down to there's different things going on in different countries than you may be used to. On a slightly lighthearted note, there's something called the traveler and grandparent scam. And while this is not nearly as severe as what I've been talking about, it's an example of the vulnerabilities that people left behind, your coworkers, friends, family face. Because you're traveling, you actually announce where you are. If somebody can compromise your accounts, compromise the way you talk to your family members, they can do things like this particular scam and get wire transfers across. Unfortunately, we see it happen a lot to grandparents because they're not quite as savvy. They don't realize that you've posted this online, and we do see people sending wire transfers of a couple $1,000s to foreign countries because somebody they know has traveled and posted that information. Which leads me to the final vulnerability. Lack of due diligence. There's a lot of ways that due diligence plays a part in cybersecurity while you're traveling. Juice jacking is an issue. On the left is a picture of charging stations in airports, and you'll notice I've got a wireless antenna circled on this slide. That's because these stations where you can charge your cellular device or mobile device allow you to plug in via USB ports. And juice jacking is when somebody siphons the data off your device because you're charging it and they're able to access it through the USB port. Hence the wireless antenna question. Why does a device like this that's supposedly just for charging need a wireless antenna? The obvious answer is so they can update the advertisement on the device and not run around to every machine. But you could do so much more with wireless access to a device like this, and travelers plugging in their mobile devices via a USB port. We also see things like fake booking websites. The travel industry is one of the most heavily targeted for fake websites, because if they can get you to book online, you're handing over your credit card information, and that information is now in the hands of criminals. And then finally, I threw up this more recent incident related to WhatsApp. The Brazilian federal police actually arrested the Latin American Facebook's vice president, Diego Zodon, because of noncompliance with a ruling related to WhatsApp. So he's Facebook's vice president for Latin America, but Facebook owns WhatsApp. And that meant that he was, in their eyes, responsible for the fact that this particular other entity, WhatsApp, had noncompliance with a court ruling. So he was actually imprisoned over this. It's a really good reminder that you need to know what's going on with your company in the countries you're traveling to. And that actually resulted in WhatsApp being blocked nationwide for a couple of days in December 2015, and again several times throughout 2016 in Brazil. Which brings me to a declassified Pentagon incident from 2008. Deputy Defense Secretary William Lynn III actually announced this incident a little bit ago, talking about a flash drive that had been infected by a foreign intelligence agency to upload malicious code onto a network run by the U.S. military Central Command. According to the Deputy Secretary, that code spread undetected on both classified and unclassified systems, from which data could be transferred to servers under foreign control. Now, the rumors online were that a particular government was responsible for this, but it was not mentioned which particular government officially. And the other rumor was that this happened because somebody picked up a thumb drive in a parking lot. Now, this incident was 2008, at which point several of you are probably connecting it to Stuxnet. Again, rumors that the Iranian nuclear plant was targeted by thumb drives dropped in and around the nuclear plant in Iran. So this is definitely a thing. Think about how many conferences you go to where you pick up thumb drives along with all kinds of other neat tech to bring back. It's a perfect way to target somebody. Due diligence says test them before you use them, or give them to your kids so it doesn't really matter. But either way, I know that collection of things, we all come home with suitcases full of swag, it's something to think about in a broader context of being targeted as a traveler. So those are the 6 vulnerabilities that I can group everything into, which brings me to the impact. Risk equation, risk equals threat times vulnerability times impact. I can't tell you the impact on your company or your government, but you have to decide, what are you willing to lose? What are you willing to risk? The device, the information on it, access to your network, business plans, contracts, your contacts. All of that feeds into the risk equation. And this just summarizes it. I've got 4 threats that I see very frequently, 6 vulnerabilities, and then the impact. When I look at cybersecurity while traveling, I try and assess the trip, the traveler, the host, the equipment and devices the person is bringing, the coworkers, families, and friends staying home, and then the gaps in my knowledge. What don't I know? So that's how I look at travel security for cybersecurity, and I think we have a couple of minutes where I can try and answer some questions. But I did want to give you a couple of recommendations out there, and I know we've got a white paper going up on our website with some information in it, which will also help you.
Stacey, thank you so much for that great presentation. We do have a number of questions And I would like to encourage everybody on the phone. We have about 8 minutes left in this hour, so we'll get through as many as we can, but if you have others, please send them in using the Q&A feature in the WebEx. First and foremost, everyone loved your graphics. I got a lot of comments about that, so people enjoyed those.
Thank you. I said it at the beginning. Cartoons are always wonderful.
Yes, they are, indeed. So the first question to get things started, do you have any recommendations for talking to senior management about these risks that you discussed?
It's hard. Talking to senior management about cybersecurity is never an easy thing, as I'm sure a lot of you know. One of the things I can do is say, change the expectation that business travelers have to be connected. We're used to that electronic leash in the United States. That is not necessarily how it works elsewhere. You're traveling for business, you're involved in other things. Really assess and try and change that culture, which can help you talk to your senior management. Also try and talk to them in business terms. Frequently we talk about things like TTPs and vulnerabilities, and that doesn't always carry over very well in business. So try and talk about not just who the threat is, but ask them to assess the impact. What are they willing to lose or have compromised? And back that information up with real-world examples. I have found real-world examples, and that's why I tried to give you a bunch in this presentation, are things that help people to understand this is not sky is falling or Hollywood made up fictional cases. It has happened to companies and governments like yours. And then my final recommendation is make sure when you talk to senior management that you have a solution, an easy way for travelers to do what they need to do, which often means bringing a clean device, having temporary accounts set up, even a Gmail account if you have to, so you can give them a way to work and do what they have to do without compromising your network. And having that solution goes pretty far.
Perfect. Thank you. And I did get that question a couple times, so I think that was really relevant. Next question, do you have a recommendation for mobile devices that do not have removable batteries? I think you mentioned removable batteries at the beginning.
I did mention recommendation for no removable batteries?
Devices that do not have removable batteries, such as iPhones?
Oh, okay. So my best recommendation is actually don't carry any device like that. Go with a simple device. Basically buy a throwaway device that you can issue to travelers and completely wipe upon their return. And by completely wipe, I mean overwrite ones and zeros several times throughout the hard drive so there is no leftover data. Instead of trying to take corporate devices that may have some of that data hidden, because it's been deleted but not fully erased, truly buy a device where you can specifically remove the hard drive, replace it if you have to, remove the battery, replace it if you have to, because it'll make your life a lot easier in the long run. I'll also point out, and I'm sure there's a couple of people who are going to cringe on this recommendation, track phones do exist, and you can buy some pretty cheap throwaway devices that are used once that don't hurt your budget too badly.
Okay, that actually leads nicely into a question that I got further down the list here. So in your opinion, if someone has traveled to China, for example, and had their laptop and cell phone with them, now they're back in the USA, should they consider that their laptop and or iPhone, for example, are compromised and should be thrown away? And would your answer change if this was 1 to 2 years ago?
So if it's 1 to 2 years ago, I think it's probably a little too late.
Okay.
My best advice, if you're traveling overseas, regardless of the country, is consider your device at least threatened, if not compromised. Don't put it back on your corporate network, whatever that means. It's just probably not worth the risk. A lot of this comes down to that individual threat, vulnerability, and impact. I can't tell you what the threat is to you, to your information, and I can't tell you what your particular vulnerabilities are. You have to assess that, so unfortunately this is a bit of a dodge. I wish I could give you a better answer though.
That's okay. We'll move along. What would you say would be the best tools to diagnose that a device has been compromised? Would that be either malware or hardware or something different?
That's probably a really tough question. Standard forensics will help you diagnose it. I really like the idea of using tamper-proof seals because that'll help you tell you if your device was compromised through one of the means like pulling the hard drive and full-on copying it. I think those work very well. Your standard forensic devices incident response software will help you figure this out, but understand that especially when you're dealing with nation-state actors, there's a lot of malware out there that will not be detected by standard forensics or anything else. And I think that's, and this is a guess and a personal guess, I think that's why you have to be very careful about assuming there's a compromise because even our best efforts may not find it right away.
Okay, and I got a couple of questions similar to each other, so I'll try to group them together. What sources of information are available to notate which countries are specifically of concern besides the obvious China and Russia, and are the websites that are useful and informative with risk information? You may have touched on that in your presentation.
Yes, so unfortunately this is not a very well documented topic outside of one-off articles, news articles out there. I particularly like the Department of State and OFAC. Their website, when you're trying to go to a country, read the country reviews the Department of State publishes. Don't just stick to the U.S. Department of State, though. I have found the Canadian website and the Australian websites also are very useful and informative because they provide a different perspective. And then do your research. I tried to mention several of the keywords that might be useful in finding things. Don't just look for travel security. Look for things like bids and contracts that are out there and other ways of getting at the similar information off of your standard cybersecurity news websites. Unfortunately, there is not one source that has this information in a very detailed manner that I've found. There are private investigative companies that collect it, but again, that's all private and you have to pay them for those travel briefings.
Okay. I'll do one more question and then we'll wrap things up. A couple questions about this. I think it was along the lines of what you were just talking about. So if an individual is traveling to a specific country, is there a way that they can go about finding information about those cybersecurity threats and laws? I think you had a slide about that, a slide or two.
So the cybersecurity laws I have found through open source monitoring. If I know somebody is going somewhere, I start keeping watch. This goes back to Department of State, goes back to news agencies in that country. All of these are really good resources. Unfortunately, there's not a singular resource. I'll put out a plug for the MS-ISAC here. MS-ISAC members can always reach out to the SOC to get additional information, and we will try and help you. But you also have to talk to your legal departments and talk to anyone you know who might be traveling because it's just not well documented at this point.
Okay, and we are at the end of the hour. I did want to, I wanted to touch on the fact that this webcast is recorded. So within a couple days of this live event, we had a couple questions from attendees. This will be posted on our MS-ISAC website. If you go to msisac.cisecurity.org and go to the webcast page, you can certainly find the webcast recording there. Also, feel free to send us an email. The best email to use for that would be info@msisac.org. And if there are any questions that we cannot answer, we can forward them along to Stacey, our presenter, and have her take care of those for us. We did put her contact information up on the screen here, so if you want to reach out to her directly or to the MS-ISAC SOC, feel free to do that. That all being said, thank you so much to our presenter, Stacey Wright, and to everyone for joining today's MS-ISAC National Webcast. A reminder that our next national webcast will take place in April of 2017, so please stay tuned for more information on that. Today's session, as I mentioned, will be available as an archive on the website within a couple days of the live event. And feel free to reach out to us with any additional questions, and thank you again, Stacey.
You're quite welcome.
Have a great day, everybody.